Madison Blake stopped the music with a single lifted finger, then pointed into the dark like she was calling out a criminal. "You there, the janitor in the back, get up here, now." Her voice cracked across the Beacon Theater sharp and bright, and it turned 600 well-dressed strangers into one synchronized stare. Ethan Carter stood beside a cleaning cart at the rear aisle, half hidden by a curtain and the glare of camera rigs. He was 34, wearing a gray uniform that still smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant, with thick yellow gloves clinging to his hands, like a confession. 10 minutes ago, he had been polishing the edge of the stage while the donors found their seats. Now a spotlight snapped onto him, exposing the sweat at his hairline, the rigid set of his jaw, the way his fingers trembled inside rubber that suddenly felt too loud. The room was not only a room, it was a machine. Phones rose, lenses zoomed. A red light in the control booth blinked as the live stream pushed the moment outward to 2 million strangers who would never meet Ethan, but were already deciding what he deserved. In the front row, a woman with diamonds at her throat smiled as if this were a bonus act. A man in a tuxedo leaned back, amused, ready to laugh at whatever happened next. Even the ushers paused, caught between their training to keep moving and the human instinct to flinch. Ethan took one step, then stopped. He could have pretended not to hear. He could have ducked behind the curtain, returned to the quiet corridors where nobody spoke his name. But he saw the giant screen behind Madison, cycling through glossy photos of children in hospital gowns, their small faces framed by hospital lights. He did not see his daughter, not yet, but he felt her anyway, like a hand on his spine. Somewhere across the city, a child's heart fought to keep time. Ethan swallowed hard and started walking. Madison watched him approach with the smile of a woman who had never been told no and had learned to confuse power with truth. She was 38, flawless, under stage makeup hair pinned like a promise. Wearing a silver gown that caught the light and threw it back in shards. She did not move to meet him. She let him climb toward her step by step like a man approaching judgment. When he reached the foot of the stage, she leaned toward the microphone and softened her tone until it sounded kind. "Let everyone see," she said, "whether you can actually sing or whether you are just taking up space." A ripple of laughter slid through the theater, polite and cruel. Ethan felt heat rush into his face, not because he was ashamed of being a janitor, but because he understood exactly what she was doing. This was not charity. This was theater inside theater, a rich woman using a poor man as a prop to make herself shine brighter. Behind Madison, the band members exchanged uneasy glances. They were professionals. They could read the air. The pianist's shoulders tightened. The drummer's sticks hovered. Nobody wanted to be the soundtrack to someone's humiliation. Madison stepped closer, close enough for Ethan to smell her perfume, something expensive with a sharp, floral edge. She looked at the gloves and gave a tiny laugh that never touched her eyes. "Oh, keep those on," she said, turning her head slightly so the cameras could catch the moment. "It makes the story better." She reached out, not gently, and grabbed his forearm, guiding him into the center of the stage lights, as if placing an object on display. The crowd leaned in. The live stream chat, unseen but relentless, began to roar. Then Madison snapped her fingers at the band the way someone might order a waiter. "Higher ground," she said. "Original key." Her lips curled into a satisfied smirk. That final note. The famous one. The impossible one. She let the words hang long enough for everyone to understand the trap. Ethan's pulse thudded in his throat. He had heard the song before, of course. Everyone had. The myth of that note had been sold and resold until it sounded like gospel. Madison lifted her chin as if she owned the laws of sound itself. Ethan stared out past the footlights and saw a sea of faces that expected him to fail. Some looked hungry for it. Others looked uncomfortable but silent the way people get when they witness cruelty dressed as entertainment. A young woman in the aisle pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with sympathy she did not dare show. A man near the center frowned, as if something about this felt wrong. But he did not stand. Nobody stood. Madison Blake had built her empire on that kind of obedience. As the band prepared to strike the opening chord, Madison leaned in close, angling her body so the cameras could not read her lips. She reached up and tapped her own microphone, then glanced toward Ethan's. For a breath, her voice dropped into a whisper, meant for one man only. "Fail quietly," she said. But the sound did not stay private. Ethan's microphone was live, and the whisper poured into the theater clean and unmistakable, and out into the live stream like a spark into dry grass. The room froze. Even the laughter died mid-throat. In the control booth, a technician's eyes widened as his hand hovered too late over a mute button. A few heads turned toward one another in disbelief, as if they had just heard the truth slip out of a mask. Madison's smile flickered, and for the first time, a crack showed through the polish. It was small, but Ethan saw it. Not confidence, fear. Not of embarrassment, but of something deeper, like a person guarding a secret with both hands. Ethan stood under the blazing lights, the glove still on the whole world staring, and something in him went strangely calm. The humiliation was real, but it was not the sharpest thing in his chest. The sharpest thing was the realization that Madison was not doing this for fun. She was doing it because she needed him small. She needed him harmless. She needed him to sing and break in front of everyone, so whatever he carried inside him would never be believed. The first chord rang out. Clean, bright, unforgiving. Ethan lifted the microphone slowly, not like a victim, but like a man opening a door he had kept shut for too long. Madison watched him with a fixed smile, expecting the stumble, the crack, the easy victory. She did not notice the way the band's music director suddenly leaned forward, listening harder as if he sensed something unfamiliar in Ethan's breathing. Ethan inhaled deep, steady as singer's breath, and the theater seemed to tilt on its axis. In that single inhale, the janitor everyone underestimated began to reveal the power Madison was trying to bury. 5 years earlier, Ethan Carter had not worn a janitor's uniform. He had stood under television lights instead. Younger, leaner, his voice untouched by grief. Back then, he was 29, a breakout favorite on a national singing competition filmed in Los Angeles, the kind of show that turned ordinary people into overnight obsessions. Judges praised his tone, coaches whispered about his range, and producers quietly adjusted camera angles to linger on his face when he sang. Madison Blake had been on that judging panel too, already famous, already powerful, already shaping narratives with a smile. Ethan's voice was not loud by nature, but it carried. It moved smoothly from warmth to height, without warning, sliding between registers like water finding its level. Vocal coaches called it rare. Online forums called him unbeatable. On the night of the semifinals, when his name was trending and his future felt solid for the first time in his life, his phone vibrated in his pocket backstage. He ignored it once, then again. On the third buzz, something cold slid into his stomach. He stepped away from the noise and answered. The call came from a hospital in San Diego. His wife Emily was in critical condition, sudden infection, rapid decline. The doctor spoke carefully professionally, but the meaning cut through every careful word. If Ethan wanted to see her conscious again, he needed to come now. He stood there with the phone pressed to his ear, the roar of the audience leaking through the walls, and felt his life split into two incompatible truths. On one side was the dream he had chased since he was a boy singing in church basements. On the other was the woman who had believed in that dream, before anyone else. Ethan did not ask permission. He did not explain himself to producers who talked about contracts and obligations. He left. By the time the show went live that night, his spot on stage was empty. Viewers were confused, then angry. Social media filled the silence with accusations. Ungrateful, unprofessional, weak. Madison Blake appeared on a morning show 2 days later and sealed the story with a single polished sentence. Anyone who does not respect opportunity does not deserve a dream. She said it calmly, convincingly, and the industry listened. Emily died 3 days after that interview. Their daughter Sophie was born early, fragile, her chest rising and falling with effort. Ethan learned the language of monitors and medical bills instead of album deals. He learned how to sleep in plastic chairs and how to smile for a child while terror gnawed at him from the inside. When he tried to return to music, later doors closed quietly. No calls returned. No auditions accepted. The show had moved on, and so had Madison's version of him, the man who walked away. So Ethan worked, whatever paid, whatever fit around hospital visits and sleepless nights. He cleaned office buildings in Phoenix, then theaters, when he moved east for cheaper rent and better doctors. He learned to keep his head down to exist without asking for space. At night, when Sophie could not sleep because her heart raced too fast, he sang softly until the machine settled. Not to impress anyone, just to keep her alive and himself whole. That was the man Madison Blake saw when she spotted him backstage at the Beacon Theater. She recognized him instantly, though she pretended not to. The face was older now, lines carved by responsibility, shoulders heavier with years of silence. And something else, something she could not name but felt like a threat. When she learned his shift assignment put him near the stage during rehearsal, her mood shifted. She sang through the sound check with sharp focus eyes flicking toward the glass he polished, listening to the room more than the band. When the song climbed toward the bridge, Madison felt it before anyone else did. The tightening, the resistance. She pushed anyway, forcing the note she had forced for years, and it fractured. Just enough. She covered it smoothly, turned to the sound engineer, and ordered the track raised. The second attempt sailed flawless, artificial. Ethan froze cloth still in his hand. He knew that sound. He had trained for years to hear the difference. The note did not belong to her. It never had. Ethan returned to the supply room after rehearsal with his mind racing. He sat on an overturned bucket and stared at his phone thumb hovering. He searched Madison's charity gala history articles buried beneath praise and glamour. One small report surfaced from a local paper ignored by most. Only 15% of donations reached the hospital partners. The rest vanished into management fees, branding, production costs. Ethan closed his eyes. This was not just about music. This was about lies stacked on lies paid for by people who trusted a story. When the gala began that evening, Ethan planned to leave. He had no intention of stepping into the light. But then Madison spoke about hope, about sick children, about truth. And the screen behind her filled with photos. Sophie's face appeared for half a second, smiling bravely in a hospital gown, her name omitted for privacy. Ethan's breath caught. His daughter was being used as proof of a lie. That was when he knew he would not walk away again. So when Madison called him out, when she dragged him onto the stage to humiliate him, she believed she was controlling the story. She believed she was repeating history, reminding everyone who held power and who did not. What she did not understand was that Ethan Carter had already lost everything that fear could take from him. The man standing under the lights was not the same man who had fled a stage years ago. He was a father who had learned the cost of silence. As the music began and the room leaned forward, Ethan felt the weight of every decision he had ever made settle into his bones. Madison expected him to crack. The audience expected him to fail. Somewhere across the city, a little girl listened through a screen, trusting her father to tell the truth with his voice. And in that fragile electric moment, Ethan understood that whatever happened next would not just expose a singer. It would decide who he was allowed to be. By the time the first note faded into the velvet ceiling of the Beacon Theater, Ethan Carter understood that the night had already slipped beyond anyone's control. He was still standing in his janitor's uniform, fingers stiff inside thin rubber gloves, while Madison Blake watched him with a smile that did not reach her eyes. To her, this was theater of humiliation, a final demonstration of hierarchy. To Ethan, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff he had avoided for 5 long years. The audience laughed softly when Madison announced him as a forgotten contestant from an old season. Phones rose, whispers spread. Ethan heard his name spoken with curiosity, then amusement. He felt heat rush to his face, but his legs did not move. Somewhere deep inside, beneath exhaustion and fear, something steadier took hold. He thought of Sophie lying in her hospital bed, small hands clutching a stuffed rabbit, her faith in him absolute. He thought of the nights he had sung into darkness with no applause, no witnesses, only love. That memory anchored him. Madison leaned closer, her microphone angled away from her lips, but not his. Her voice dropped to a whisper that slid cleanly through the speakers. Fail quietly. It was meant to crush him. Instead, it clarified everything. Ethan lifted his head and looked out at the sea of faces, at the glowing red eye of the main camera, at millions of unseen viewers leaning forward from couches and hospital rooms and break rooms. For the first time since Emily's death, he felt no urge to disappear. The band waited for a cue. Madison snapped her fingers sharply and gestured toward Ethan, granting him permission as if he were a child. The backing track swelled rich and polished, designed to carry anyone brave or foolish enough to stand in front of it. Ethan did not sing. Not yet. He listened. He felt the sound move through the space, felt how it pressed and pulled. And then he spoke. "Could you turn off the backing track, please?" The sentence was quiet, almost polite, but it cut through the room like a blade. The band froze. Madison's smile tightened just a fraction. She laughed lightly, waving a dismissive hand, telling the audience the track was part of the arrangement. Ethan nodded once as if considering her answer, then continued, his voice steady. "During rehearsal you sang without it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Madison's eyes flashed. She spoke about professional context, about protecting the voice. Ethan listened, then asked again this time, looking directly at her. "Then could you sing first? Just you?" The silence that followed was heavy and unmistakable. Madison's laughter came sharper, now defensive. She turned to the sound engineer and ordered the track cut. The music stripped bare instantly, every flaw exposed. Madison lifted the microphone and began, her voice strong, at first practiced commanding. Relief washed through parts of the audience. Perhaps this was all a misunderstanding. Then the melody climbed. Ethan watched her neck tense, her shoulders rise. He heard the subtle shift as the sound grew thinner, forced. When she reached for the note she claimed as her crown, her voice splintered, collapsing short of its mark. Gasps scattered across the room. Madison recovered quickly, clearing her throat, blaming fatigue. She spoke about long tours and technique, about why artists relied on support. Ethan did not raise his voice when he replied. "You cannot sing it." The words landed harder than a shout. Madison spun toward him, fury barely contained. She spoke of years in the industry, of awards and sales. Ethan listened, then stepped closer to the microphone, no longer hiding. On your album, you sing that note dozens of times. Live recordings, too. Always perfect. But what you sang just now was not the same frequency. A man near the front called out, asking if that was true. Phones rose higher. Madison's face flushed. Ethan continued explaining calmly, precisely naming numbers, naming differences. He said the voice on the album did not belong to her. He said it belonged to another woman. That was when the room tipped. From the side of the stage, a man stepped forward, pale but resolute. Kevin Brooks, the sound engineer, spoke before Madison could stop him. He admitted the truth in simple sentences. The track, every show, every time. Madison stared at him as if he had struck her. She fired him on the spot. Kevin nodded. He spoke of Ethan's courage, of his own silence, of the weight of watching lies win. The crowd shifted. The balance of belief moved visibly, like a tide turning. Madison tried to reclaim control, shouting about credentials, about fame. Someone in the audience shouted back, demanding proof. Sing it again. Madison looked at Ethan and then really looked at him, and something dark twisted in her expression. Fine, she said coldly. You sing, right now, no warm-up. Ethan's hands trembled. He felt the old fear surge, the memory of walking away from a stage to run toward loss. Then he heard a voice from the seats, older, steady. Sing the way you sing for your daughter. Ethan closed his eyes. He breathed. He felt his body remember what his mind had buried. When he opened his eyes and nodded to the band, there was no track waiting to save him. Only truth. The first notes came gently, almost fragile. Some in the audience looked uncertain. Then the sound grew. It opened. It climbed without strain, without force. Each note landed clean, inevitable. When he reached the place where Madison had failed, Ethan did not hesitate. His voice lifted clear and ringing, a pure line of sound that cut through the room and held. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the theater erupted. Ethan stood there, breath shaking, as applause crashed over him like a wave. Madison Blake stared as if the ground had fallen away beneath her. And somewhere far beyond the walls of the Beacon Theater, a little girl felt her heart slow and smiled, believing in her father with everything she had. The applause did not fade gently. It detonated. It came in waves that shook the balconies, rattled the lights, and forced the band to stand, clapping in disbelief. Ethan Carter remained frozen at center stage, chest heaving, palms damped the echo of his final note, still vibrating inside his bones. For a moment, he wondered if this was another dream he would wake from too soon, another cruel trick of memory. Then he saw Madison Blake's face, pale and rigid, and he knew this was real. Phones were everywhere now. Screens glowing. Live comments racing faster than any moderator could follow. The camera no longer framed Madison as the icon of the night. It hunted reactions, the gasps, the tears, the stunned smiles. Somewhere near the front row, a woman rose to her feet slowly, her hands shaking as she applauded. It was Gloria Reed, a legendary soul singer in her 60s, invited as a guest of honor. Her eyes were wet when she spoke, voice breaking, as it carried through the microphones. That was not just singing. That was truth with nowhere to hide. The room erupted again. Another man stood, older, sharp-eyed, unmistakably industry. Marcus Hill, a producer whose name lived quietly behind dozens of platinum records, cleared his throat and spoke without theatrics. He said he had mixed Madison's biggest album himself. He said the high notes did not belong to her. He said the voice came from a studio singer named Rachel Hayes, paid once and buried under paperwork. Each sentence landed like a hammer. Journalists leaned forward. Hands flew across keyboards. Madison opened her mouth, but the sound that came out was thin, unconvincing, already drowned by momentum. She screamed then. About injustice, about betrayal, about how everyone used tracks. She named bigger stars, dragged legends into her defense. Gloria shot back instantly, her voice sharp with authority. They do not lie about it. They do not sell honesty and deliver illusion. That is fraud. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Madison looked around for support and found none. Her band had stepped back. Her manager was already on his phone, jaw tight. Fear crept into her expression, naked and undeniable. Madison turned on Ethan one last time, stepping close enough for only him to hear. She told him he would regret this. She promised consequences. She mentioned his child. The threat was soft, precise, meant to burrow deep. But Ethan did not flinch. For the first time in years, the fear did not stick. He looked at her and answered calmly, clearly, so every microphone caught it. I do not work for this industry. I sing because I love it. You cannot take that from me. Silence fell then. A single clap began somewhere in the upper balcony. Another joined it, then another. Until the entire theater rose as one applauding not a performance, but a refusal to lie. Madison Blake stood alone, exposed under lights that no longer flattered. She said nothing more. She turned and walked off stage, heels striking wood with sharp finality. The moment she disappeared into the wings, the noise returned tenfold. Within minutes, the world outside the theater caught fire. Social platforms exploded. Headlines wrote themselves. Famous singer exposed live. Janitor stuns gala. Career built on lies. Ethan's name surged across screens he had never imagined touching again. He did not celebrate. He stood amid the chaos, feeling only a strange stillness, the quiet after a storm you survive without knowing how. Security eventually cleared the room. Backstage, the air buzzed with urgent whispers, lawyers barking into phones, producers arguing timelines. Ethan sat on a folding chair near a brick wall, his body finally catching up with exhaustion. An older janitor named Frank, who had worked the theater for decades, sat beside him without speaking. They watched people rush past as if Ethan were invisible again, except this time, invisibility felt like peace. Ethan's phone vibrated. A video call. Sophie. Her face filled the screen, pale but smiling eyes bright with pride. Daddy, I saw you. You were beautiful. His throat closed. He asked if she felt okay. She nodded, said the nurses watched too. They said your voice helped everyone breathe. Ethan turned away, tears slipping free at last. The night stretched on. Close to midnight, when the building had mostly emptied, a woman in a tailored suit approached him. Her name was Laura Bennett, Madison's attorney. Her smile was professional, practiced, expensive. She said she wanted to resolve a misunderstanding. Ethan listened as she laid papers on the table, numbers spoken softly, offers framed as kindness. Money for silence. Security for surrender. Ethan looked at the documents without touching them. He thought of Sophie's heart monitor, of Emily's voice telling him she was proud, of the man he had been when he walked away from a stage years ago. He pushed the papers back. There is no misunderstanding, he said. There is only truth. Laura's smile vanished. She warned him of lawsuits, of smears of consequences he could not afford. Ethan nodded. He understood. As she walked away, Frank placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and steady. We fight then, the old man said quietly. Ethan looked down at his trembling hands and realized something had changed forever. He was still a janitor, still a father, still afraid. But the silence that had once defined him was gone. And whatever came next, he would meet it standing. The night did not end when the applause collapsed into echoes. It only transformed into something heavier, quieter, and far more dangerous than noise. Backstage at the Civic Concert Hall, Ethan Carter sat on a narrow folding chair, his back straight, his hands resting flat on his thighs, as if anchoring himself to the present moment. Around him, crew members whispered urgently, cables were dragged across the floor, and phones kept lighting up with breaking alerts. The smell of dust, sweat, and overheated lights hung in the air, thick and metallic. Nothing felt finished, only paused. Ray Thompson sat beside him without saying a word. The older custodian did not offer praise or advice, did not ask how it felt to stand in front of thousands and expose a lie. He simply remained there, solid and unmoving, like a wall that had survived every storm the building had ever known. Every few moments, Ray tapped his knee unconsciously, a steady rhythm that reminded Ethan time was still passing. That small human habit grounded him more than any applause could have. Silence shared felt safer than words. Ethan's ears still rang not from volume, but from recognition. He had heard his own voice again, unfiltered, unhidden, no longer borrowed or restrained by fear. That realization alone pressed heavily on his chest, more overwhelming than the confrontation itself. For years, his voice had lived only in hospital rooms and empty apartments meant for one small listener. Tonight, it had spoken to the world, and the world had answered loudly, unpredictably. His phone vibrated once, then again, then again. Ethan ignored it, staring instead at a long crack in the concrete floor that resembled a fault line. When the screen lit up a fourth time, Ray glanced briefly, then looked away without comment. Ethan finally exhaled and checked the call. It was the hospital. His pulse spiked before he even stood up. He rose so quickly the chair scraped sharply against the floor, drawing a few startled glances. Ray was on his feet immediately, concern etched into his lined face. Ethan answered as he walked into the hallway, heart pounding hard enough to feel in his throat. The nurse's voice was calm and professional, trained to soothe, even when news carried weight. Sophie had watched the live stream from her hospital bed. Her heart rate had spiked briefly, then stabilized. She was awake now, asking for him, wanting to know if he was coming. Relief and guilt collided inside Ethan's chest, leaving him breathless. He promised he would be there soon. Promised again when the nurse gently reminded him to drive carefully. When the call ended, he stood still for a moment, eyes closed, pressing his palm against the wall. Then he returned backstage only to find someone waiting near the doorway. She stood with perfect posture, dressed in a tailored gray suit that radiated authority. Her heels made no sound against the floor. In her hand was a leather briefcase that carried the quiet weight of power. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, "my name is Evelyn Moore. I represent Madison Blake." Ray instinctively stepped closer to Ethan, positioning himself just slightly in front. Ethan did not stop him. Evelyn's smile was polite, measured, and carefully empty. "I am not here to threaten you," she continued. "I am here to resolve an unfortunate misunderstanding before it escalates unnecessarily." Ethan said nothing. He had learned that silence unsettled people who expected emotion. Evelyn opened her briefcase and removed a neat stack of documents, placing them carefully on a nearby table. "This agreement clarifies that tonight's incident was emotionally charged and misunderstood," she said evenly. "You acknowledge that your statements were inaccurate and made under pressure. In return, my client agrees not to pursue legal action and will offer compensation for the distress you experienced." "Compensation," Ethan repeated quietly. Evelyn nodded. "A substantial settlement paid immediately. No delays, no drawn-out process." She paused deliberately before adding that they were also aware of his daughter's medical needs. All related expenses would be fully covered. The words struck with precision. For a moment the room faded. Ethan saw Sophie under white hospital lights, saw invoices filled with impossible numbers, felt the old instinct rise to bend and endure for survival. Ray's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Ethan picked up the first page and read carefully. The language was smooth, elegant, designed to erase without appearing to. He would issue a public apology, retract his statements, and agree never to speak about the event again. The truth would be folded away behind legal phrasing, sealed and forgotten. Madison Blake would remain untouched, preserved by silence. "If I sign this," Ethan said evenly, "you admit nothing." "Correct," Evelyn replied. "This protects all parties." "No," Ethan said quietly. "It protects one party." Evelyn's smile thinned. "Mr. Carter, you need to understand the reality here. My client has resources, time, entire legal teams. This can become very difficult for you and your family." Ethan finally met her eyes. Beneath the confidence, he saw urgency, even fear, not of him, but of momentum slipping away. "5 years ago," Ethan said softly, "I walked away from everything I thought mattered because someone I loved was dying. People said I was weak and irresponsible. But I did it anyway." He paused. "I am not signing this. I did not lie tonight, and I will not teach my daughter that truth is something you sell when it becomes inconvenient." For the first time, Evelyn's composure cracked. Her voice hardened as she warned of defamation investigations and relentless pressure. Ray's fists clenched. Ethan nodded once. "I understand." Evelyn gathered the papers, irritation tightly controlled, and slid them back into her briefcase. "When this becomes unbearable, remember, you were given an alternative," she said before leaving. The room felt colder after she was gone. Ray exhaled slowly and asked if he was sure. Ethan's hands trembled, but his voice did not. He had never been more sure. An hour later, he sat in his car outside the hospital forehead, resting against the steering wheel as exhaustion replaced adrenaline. Notifications flooded his phone, praise and venom tangled together. He turned the screen face down and went inside. Sophie was awake, eyes bright, despite the machines. When she saw him, she smiled. "Daddy, you sang," she whispered. He took her hand gently and admitted he had been terrified. She nodded thoughtfully and said, "Brave people were scared, but did the right thing anyway." Ethan swallowed hard. Holding her hand, he understood he had crossed the point of no return. The truth was no longer his alone, and he would not abandon it. The courtroom felt nothing like a stage yet. The tension inside it was heavier than any spotlight Ethan Carter had ever known. The room was smaller than he expected, almost plain, with wooden benches worn smooth by decades of quiet verdicts and fluorescent lights that offered no warmth or mercy. There was no music here, no applause, no escape. Only truth measured in words that could either protect him or destroy what little stability he had left. Madison Blake arrived surrounded by attorneys, 5 of them each dressed in muted confidence folders, aligned expressions rehearsed. She wore a navy jacket and an expression carefully crafted to suggest dignity under attack. To anyone who did not know the full story, she looked like the victim of an unexpected rebellion. Ethan sat across the aisle beside Melissa Grant, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his posture calm but deliberate. He wore the only clean dress shirt he owned, white and slightly loose at the shoulders, as if borrowed from a better version of himself. This was not the trial. This was the opening move. Madison's legal team had filed for an injunction demanding that Ethan Rachel Hayes and anyone connected to the gala be barred from speaking publicly. A gag order. Silence enforced by law. If granted, the truth would freeze in place, unable to grow, unable to reach anyone who still needed to hear it. Ethan understood the strategy immediately. If they could not erase the evidence, they would suffocate it. The judge entered without ceremony. Judge Eleanor Whitman, early 60s, sharp eyes that missed nothing. The room rose, then settled again. Madison's lead attorney stood first and spoke at length about reputational damage, about reckless accusations, about how false narratives could destroy careers built over decades. He spoke of intent and harm, carefully avoiding facts. At one point, he gestured subtly toward Ethan, referring to him as a disgruntled former contestant, a maintenance worker who misunderstood professional performance standards. Ethan felt heat rise in his chest, but he did not move. He had learned patience the hard way in hospital corridors and sleepless nights waiting for machines to beep or not beep. He let the man talk. When it was Melissa's turn, she stood without drama. Her voice was steady, controlled, stripped of ornament. She did not argue emotion. She asked permission to present unedited footage from the gala. The judge nodded. The lights dimmed slightly, and the screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. They watched Madison call Ethan onto the stage. They saw her grip his arm, heard the condescension wrapped in sweetness. They heard the whispered threat fail quietly broadcast through an open microphone. They watched Madison attempt the high note and fail, watched her recover with practiced excuses. Watched Ethan speak calmly, naming what his ears could hear and what her voice could not do. When the video ended, no one spoke. Melissa broke the silence with precision. She said Ethan had not sought attention. He had been summoned. She said his statements were factual, not malicious. She said truth that costs someone money is not defamation. It is consequence. Then she turned to Madison's attorney and asked the question the entire case balanced on. Do you have evidence that Mr. Carter's statements are false? The attorney hesitated. He spoke about industry norms, about vocal support, about creative context. Judge Whitman lifted one hand slightly, stopping him mid-sentence. Yes or no? The pause stretched too long. Finally, the attorney admitted they did not have direct evidence. Judge Whitman made a note expression unreadable, then turned to Melissa. Do you have evidence supporting Mr. Carter's claims? Melissa nodded once. She called Rachel Hayes to the stand. Rachel walked forward slowly, shoulders squared, her presence quiet but unshakable. She was sworn in and spoke without flourish. She presented contracts that listed her voice, but not her name. Emails instructing silence. Audio files layered into Madison's recordings. She described how she had been paid once cheaply and bound by non-disclosure agreements designed to outlast fear. When Melissa asked what she felt watching Ethan be attacked, Rachel paused before answering. I felt ashamed, she said. Because he was telling the truth, I was too afraid to say. Ethan looked down at his hands, blinking hard. He understood that fear. He had lived inside it for years. Then Judge Whitman did something no one expected. She turned her gaze directly on Madison Blake. Miss Blake, she said calmly, although you are not on the stand, you are still under oath in this courtroom. You are asking this court to silence people who say you cannot sing a specific note. Then prove them wrong. A ripple passed through the room. Madison's attorneys shifted in their seats. Madison herself went still, her face draining of color. Sing it now, the judge said. Madison spoke about warm-ups, about vocal health, about conditions. Judge Whitman remained unmoved. "You have performed on demand for 15 years," she said evenly. "This should not be difficult." Madison opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Not a note. Not even a breath shaped into sound. The silence was absolute. Judge Whitman struck the gavel. "The request for an injunction is denied. Furthermore, this court finds the plaintiff's action frivolous and intended to silence truthful speech. Sanctions will be applied." The room erupted. Reporters stood, voices overlapping. Madison remained seated, frozen, exposed in a way no spotlight had ever managed. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, not triumph, but air. The kind of breath you take after being held underwater too long. Outside the courthouse, microphones pushed forward. Someone asked Ethan how he felt. He answered without thinking. "Like I can finally stand without being pushed." As he walked away beside Melissa, the weight of what had happened settled slowly. The fight was not over. Lawsuits remained. Smears would continue. But something irreversible had occurred. The truth had crossed into a place where power usually won. And this time, it had not. The court ruling did not end the storm. It sharpened it. By the next morning, Ethan Carter's name had spread far beyond music circles. News panels replayed the footage in slow motion, freezing on Madison Blake's silence in the courtroom, then cutting to Ethan's still figure as the gavel fell. Commentators framed the story in competing ways. A victory for truth, a warning to celebrities, a dangerous precedent. Ethan did not watch. He sat beside his daughter's hospital bed, listening to the irregular rhythm of machines and wondering how a single decision could ripple so violently through the world. Messages poured in faster than he could answer. Some were kind, others were cautious, testing the waters. Many came from people who had lived in the shadows of the industry for years. Studio singers, backup vocalists, sound engineers, people who recognized themselves in Ethan's silence and Rachel Hayes' confession. One voicemail came from a woman who said she had given her voice to 3 platinum records and never once heard her name spoken aloud. She cried as she thanked him. Ethan sat with the phone in his hand long after the message ended, feeling the weight of something larger than his own story. Madison Blake disappeared from public view, but her presence lingered like smoke. Official statements were released by her team, carefully worded, filled with phrases like creative misunderstanding and evolving performance standards. Her label announced an internal review. Sponsors quietly paused campaigns. Yet beneath the surface, the pressure intensified. Anonymous accounts resurfaced with old photos, old rumors, old distortions. Comment sections filled with doubts seeded deliberately. Ethan's past was picked apart, frame by frame. Why had he really left that show years ago? Why had he waited so long to speak? The same question dressed in different clothes. Melissa Grant warned him this phase was inevitable. When power loses its grip, it looks for something to crush. Ethan listened, nodded, and returned to Sophie's bedside. The world could argue later. Right now, his daughter needed him. Present, steady, unafraid. 3 days after the ruling, the hospital called earlier than expected. Sophie's heart had grown weaker overnight. The numbers on the monitor told a story no one wanted to hear. Waiting was no longer an option. The surgery needed to happen immediately. Not next week. Not when insurance finished its review. Now. Ethan thanked the doctor, his voice calm, out of habit, then leaned against the wall as the hallway seemed to tilt around him. He closed his eyes and breathed slow and deliberate, the way Sophie had taught him during her worst nights. That evening, as rain streaked the window beside Sophie's bed, Ethan's phone rang again. An unfamiliar number. He hesitated. Too many calls lately carried weight he could barely hold. But something told him to answer. The voice on the other end was gentle, professional, unmistakably careful. It belonged to a representative calling on behalf of a legendary musician, someone whose songs had once played on the radio, while Ethan cleaned empty offices at night. There was no speech, no condition, no request for publicity. Just a simple statement. The full cost of Sophie's surgery would be covered. Completely. Ethan sat down slowly, the phone still pressed to his ear, as the words settled into him. He asked if there was any paperwork, any expectation. The answer was no. This was not charity as spectacle. It was help offered quietly. When he ended the call, his hands shook. Tears blurred his vision before he realized they were falling. Sophie's stirred eyes fluttering open, her small fingers tightening around his. "Daddy," she whispered. "Are you okay?" Ethan smiled through the ache in his chest and nodded. "I am now, sweetheart." The night stretched on in soft intervals of beeping machines and whispered conversations. Nurses moved efficiently, compassion practiced, but real. Melissa stopped by briefly, her expression tired but relieved. She spoke of next steps, of momentum shifting, of how public opinion was settling into something firmer now that evidence had replaced speculation. Ethan listened, but his attention kept returning to Sophie, to the rise and fall of her chest, to the fragile miracle of breath. Near midnight, Sophie asked him to sing. Ethan hesitated. His voice felt raw, scraped by days of speaking and nights without sleep. But she looked at him with quiet certainty, the kind that did not question whether he would try. He leaned close and sang softly the same lullaby he had sung in rented rooms and hospital corners for years. Not for courage, not for hope, just for presence. Sophie's breathing steadied as it always did. Somewhere deep inside, Ethan felt the echo of the stage, the applause, the judgment all fade into irrelevance. By morning, the hospital moved quickly. Consent forms were signed, IV lines adjusted. The surgical team introduced themselves with calm professionalism. Ethan kissed Sophie's forehead as they wheeled her away, his hand lingering until the last possible second. "I will be right here," he promised. She smiled, brave beyond her years. "I know, Daddy." The hours that followed were the longest of his life. Ethan paced the waiting room, sat, stood, paced again. Messages continued to arrive, but he ignored them all. The world could wait. When the doors finally opened and the surgeon stepped out at mask, lowered eyes, tired but kind, Ethan felt his knees weaken. The surgery had been successful. The words did not register at first. Then they crashed into him all at once. Ethan sank into a chair, hands covering his face, years of fear and restraint breaking free. He did not try to stop it. He did not need to be strong in that moment. Sophie would wake with a repaired heart. That was enough. As the sun rose over the city, casting pale light through the hospital windows, Ethan realized something had shifted permanently. Not just for him, for the people who had lived unheard, for voices buried beneath contracts and fear. Truth had not simply survived. It had made space. And in that space, something new was beginning to breathe. Morning arrived without mercy. Ethan Carter woke to the sound of his phone vibrating endlessly on the nightstand, a mechanical insect that refused to die. He had slept less than 3 hours, his body still buzzing from adrenaline and dread. When he finally opened his eyes, the screen was already glowing with hundreds of notifications, messages stacked on top of one another, like waves crashing faster than he could breathe. He did not open them at first. He sat still, listening to Sophie's soft breathing from the hospital bed across the room, reminding himself why he was still standing. By mid-morning, the storm broke in full. Headlines spread with ruthless efficiency, each one sharpening the story into something more sensational. Some praised courage, others questioned motives. Anonymous sources appeared instantly, claiming inside knowledge of Ethan's past. Photos of his apartment surfaced online, framed as evidence of desperation rather than hardship. Comment sections filled with cruelty disguised as analysis. Ethan read none of it directly, but the weight of it pressed into the room all the same, thick as humidity before a storm. By noon, the legal strike landed. A courier arrived with formal documents, heavy papers stamped with authority. Madison Blake was suing. Not just Ethan, but Rachel Hayes, the sound engineer who spoke up, and even the venue itself. The number was staggering, designed not to win, but to terrify. Strategic Melissa would later explain, a lawsuit meant to exhaust, not prove. Ethan held the papers with shaking hands, the ink blurring, as fear finally pushed past his defenses. This was the moment Evelyn had warned him about. The lies followed quickly after. Stories appeared questioning Sophie's illness, suggesting exaggeration, manipulation, fabrication. Others painted Ethan as unstable, opportunistic, hungry for attention. The cruelty was surgical. Each article echoed the last, reinforcing doubt, until repetition felt like truth. Ethan sat beside Sophie's bed phone, trembling in his hand, watching the world attempt to erase him by drowning him in noise. For the first time since refusing the settlement, his resolve wavered. That night, Sophie woke, struggling to breathe. Alarms sounded. Nurses rushed in. Doctors spoke in clipped phrases Ethan barely processed. Her condition had worsened faster than expected. Surgery could no longer wait. Days were now hours. When the room finally settled again, Ethan found himself alone in the hallway, staring at the floor as the reality crushed down on him. He pulled out his phone and hovered over a familiar name, Evelyn Moore. One call, one signature, everything would stop. The door creaked softly behind him. Sophie appeared, dragging her IV pole, eyes tired but clear. "Daddy?" she whispered. He rushed to her side, kneeling to her height, forcing a smile that nearly broke him. She asked why people were saying bad things about him. Ethan hesitated, then answered simply, "Because sometimes telling the truth makes people angry." Sophie frowned, thinking hard, then said something that cut deeper than any threat. "But you always tell me lying is wrong, even when it is scary." In that moment, the call button on his phone went dark. Ethan hugged her gently, his resolve knitting itself back together with painful clarity. He carried her back to bed, sat beside her, and sang softly until her breathing steadied again. He did not sleep that night. He did not need to. Fear had burned itself out, leaving something harder in its place. The shift came the next evening. A video appeared online, quiet at first, then spreading like fire. Rachel Hayes sat in a recording studio, contracts laid out in front of her, her voice steady as she told the truth she had buried for years. She named names. She showed proof. She admitted fear. Within hours, others followed. Studio singers, backup vocalists, people with nothing left to lose. Each story layered onto the last, turning speculation into evidence. By morning, the narrative cracked. Major outlets pivoted. Sponsors froze accounts. Madison Blake's silence became louder than any denial. Public opinion swung with violent speed, shame replacing certainty. Ethan watched none of it directly. He sat in the hospital waiting room instead, counting breaths, hands clasped together so tightly, his knuckles ached. When the surgeon finally emerged, exhaustion etched deep into his face. Ethan stood so fast the chair fell backward. The surgery had been successful. Sophie's heart was repaired. The words took a moment to land, then shattered him completely. He cried without restraint, grief and relief, collapsing into one overwhelming release. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe she might live. In the days that followed, consequences rippled outward. Madison Blake's sponsors withdrew. Her label terminated her contract. Investigations began quietly, then publicly. The lawsuit unraveled under the weight of evidence, dismissed with sanctions for abuse of process. Ethan was offered interviews, deals, apologies from people who had once looked away. He declined most of them. His victory had already happened, and it had nothing to do with fame. Weeks later, Ethan stood once more inside the same hall, not as a janitor, not as an accuser, but as a performer. The audience was different this time. Nurses, custodians, teachers, parents. Sophie sat in the front row, healthier now, her smile brighter than the lights above the stage. When Ethan sang, his voice was not perfect. It carried scars. But it was real, and it was free. As the final note faded, he understood the truth that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Power did not live in silence or money or fear. It lived in the moment someone refused to be erased. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. From a professional perspective, this story is not truly about music fame or even scandal. It is about power dynamics, ethical courage, and the psychology of silence. When systems reward compliance and punish honesty, most people choose survival over truth. What makes this story extraordinary is not the talent revealed on stage, but the moment a person with nothing left to lose chose integrity anyway. History shows that real change never begins with the powerful. It begins when ordinary people refuse to accept a lie as normal. If this story resonated with you, if you believe voices like this deserve to be heard, gently tap like and subscribe. It tells the platform that stories about courage, truth, and human dignity still matter. Now I want to hear from you. In the comments, write just one short phrase, no more than 3 words. Tell us, speak the truth.